Good evening. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for coming out tonight to enjoy the Agrarian Voices presentation, Belonging in Kentucky, the Life and Work of Bell Hooks. A request and then just some basic information. Please remember to turn off your phones. Tonight's presentation is being taped for a future broadcast in the Agrarian Voices Distinguished Lecture Series. There will be an opportunity to ask questions afterwards. Please write your questions on the index cards, and then we'll pick them up after the presentation, and we can answer your questions. The restrooms are here, and then there's one close to the back door that you can use. And we are conducting book sales tonight. Emily is there. Furthermore, you can order Bell Hooks books from the bookstore at the Berry Center by visiting berrycenterbookstore.com. Refer to the printed bibliography available. It was at the door, but I've moved it up here. This is a list of Bell Hooks publications that you might find useful if you're interested in reading more of her work. My name is Michelle Guthrie. I'm the director of the archive in the Tanya Amix Berry Agrarian Library at the Berry Center. This evening's lecture is a joint presentation of the Berry Center Farm and Forest Institute and the bookstore at the Berry Center and the archives at the Berry Center, and has been made possible thanks to the generous support of the Josephine Ardery Foundation, a Lexington, Kentucky-based foundation which supports educational programming of Kentucky nonprofits in the arts, music, and literature. As this is our first Agrarian Voices Lecture of 2024, I would like to give you a little bit of background for the program. The concept of this lecture series, based on the principles and understandings of agrarianism, was our work toward an education in homecoming, recognizing the value of our agricultural history and its legacy. I had thought that bringing our community together, learners and residents, by offering people of notable accomplishments for their commentary and experience and largely agrarian points of view or issues would be valuable. Virginia Berry Aguilar has developed the Agrarian Voices Lecture Series, raising appreciation of our home place in all of the programming for the bookstore. Since its beginning in 2017, her Agrarian Literary League has given away nearly 2,500 books to Henry County residents as part of our work to foster the preservation of local histories, strengthen pride and stewardship of place, and conserve our rural culture. Toward those same ends, the bookstore recently sponsored a conversation between Nick Offerman and Helen Rebanks to talk about her memoir, The Shepherd's Wife, My Life in Days, an Agrarian Voices lecture by Berea's Sarah Hall, who wrote Sown in the Stars, and Georgia Green Stamper lecture and reading of her book, Small Acreages. Georgia Green Stamper will also lead a series of workshops, Write Your Own Agrarian Story, in March of 2024, co-sponsored by the Berry Center Farm and Forest Institute. Director of the Institute, Dr. Leah Bayens, plans and produces and integrates Agrarian Voices lectures into its long course offerings. We welcome 15 of those participants to this evening's presentation. Tonight's program will be a conversation between Dr. Megan Feifer, visiting professor scholar of the Bell Hooks Center at Berea College. Her colleague, Abby Houston, digital initiatives librarian at Hutchins Library of Berea College and co-creator of the Bell Hooks Digital Archive. She holds a Master of Arts in Art History from Syracuse University. Her research and teaching engage with digital humanities information and digital literacy and trauma-informed care in academic libraries, special collections, and archives, with Dr. Leah Bayens, Director of the Farm and Forest Institute at the Berry Center. Welcome.
Thank you.
They have come together to talk about Bell Hooks, the late writer and teacher, born Gloria Jean Watkins in Hopkinsville, Kentucky in 1952. She became well known for her writing on gender, race, and feminism. She focused especially on the voices of Black and working class women in the 30 books, or well, I think it's actually closer to 40 books that she wrote. She wrote literary criticism, some children's fiction, nonfiction. She has in those nonfiction titles self-help, memoir, and poetry. Her topics were education, capitalism, American history, love, friendship, very wide-ranging, always interesting. Her style brought her books to the attention not only of the public, but of educators. Her writing became required reading in many college courses. She left Kentucky in the early 70s to earn an English degree at Stanford University in 1973 and advanced degrees from the University of Wisconsin and University of California, Santa Cruz. And she had teaching experience at Yale, Oberlin College, City College of New York. And one of the topics we'll explore tonight is her return to Kentucky in 2004 to teach at Berea College. Her first book was Ain't I a Woman? Black Women and Feminism, about working class and black women who were marginalized in society. And many of them resisted actually being aligned with conventional feminist movement. Other books, All About Love, Bone Black, Memories of Girlhood, Belonging, A Culture of Place, and the very popular Sisters of the Yam, valued by black readers seeking self-healing, but also white people who wish to understand racism and its effects that linger until today. Bell Hooks highlights ways people of color make community that draws one home, even in the face of oppression, to find power and dignity in those connections. This thought that people of color have made rich communities in the face of terrible odds and have found their power and dignity is what endears her to so many. And the friendship and communications between Wendell and Bell Hooks is one of the topics we'll talk about tonight. So we're so fortunate to have visiting with us the creator of the Bell Hooks Digital Archive, Abby Houston, for among the personal effects of people, if examined with enough sympathy and knowledge as possible to find their story, its context, its depth, and the truth of a person's life and work, in a way that's not always possible if you only have reference works or biographies. Her colleague, Dr. Megan Feifer, who is the inaugural teacher, scholar in residence at the Bell Hooks Center, she will be talking about Bell Hooks' life, her choice to return to Kentucky and Berea College, and criticisms she dealt with, and her experience as an African American who was from and loved her Appalachian home. The archive at the Berry Center, to connect the archives, is a rich trove of materials that we have, materials from the Berry family. And an archive is made up of letters, speeches, articles, editorials, photographs, interviews, and they all enable us to tell a story. The story of agriculture in the state of Kentucky, and the work and the legacy of three great agrarians is what makes up our archive: John Berry Sr., John Berry Jr., and Wendell Berry. And when visitors come, I inevitably tell them the story of the life and work of John Berry Sr. Lucky to have some materials I brought up here to show you what types of things we have in the archives. I have a couple of picture snapshots of Mr. Berry's own father, who suffered, now this is Mr. Berry Sr., his father, who suffered from the lack of a program around marketing tobacco to the extent that he received nothing for his year's work in 1906. So this is not something that you would necessarily find out in a book, but an archive will have those materials that you can experience and see for yourself. He has letters to members of Kentucky's congressional delegation, thanking them for their work, for staying in a position of influence in support of these small people, Kentucky's average family farmers. He's got letters from secretaries of congressmen, enemies of his program, telling Mr. Berry that no time will it be possible for the congressman to meet with Mr. Berry. So I've kept those close to my heart. Articles from those same enemies of Mr. Berry's with his comments in the side. This is wrong. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And so you get, that's a whole thing for archivists to look at margin comments by the people whose papers that they have. And so Mr. Berry's rich in margin comments. An artifact I especially treasure is a wonderful picture of John and Wendell. They're probably about 4 and 5 years old, and they're smiling in the door of their grandfather's barn, and they're smiling up at Nick Watkins, who with his wife Georgie, Wendell writes about in The Hidden Wound, and of whom he says, "They don't figure in my thoughts and my memory as objects of pity, but rather as friends and teachers, ancestors, you could say, the forebears of certain essential strains in my thinking." So that's what we have in our archives, and I am eager to hear the contents of your archives and the information that you have, and the good moderating that you're going to be doing, bringing out certain important points. So please welcome Dr. Megan Feifer, Abby Houston from Berea College, and the moderator, Dr. Leah Bayens, the Berry Center Farm and Forest Institute.
Could we also give another round of applause to Michelle? She's done a lot of amazing work. And we want to give credit where credit is due. Good evening. Speaking on behalf of myself and my partner in crime, Abby Houston, I just want to say we are delighted to be here. This comes out of a conversation the four of us have been having for about a year now about ways in which we can put these two prolific writers in conversation. So we're really excited to be here. So what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about bell hooks in general to give us some framing, and then we're going to have a really rich conversation, and we're looking forward to questions. So welcome. Just some basic information, and we've included some archival photos about Belle. She was born Gloria Jean Watkins in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Black intellectual and dissident feminist of our time. So as Michelle was saying, Belle's writing spans topic, spans genre. She's born in 1952 to working class family, right? So her father's a janitor, her mom is a stay-at-home mom, but does a lot of odd jobs on the side to support the family. She graduates from Stanford in 1975. With a BA in English, and then she goes on to obtain a master's in English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then goes from there to complete her doctorate in English at Santa Cruz. She joins Berea in 2004, and she was a distinguished professor in residence, and she was there until her passing not that long ago. She published 21?
Yeah, 2021.
She published around 40 books, which is amazing, including poetry and children's books. And we've just included an image of her meal card for while she was at Stanford. All right. Yeah. So Kentucky is My Fate was an essay that Belle wrote. And she talked a lot about, this sort of what it's like to be a Black intellectual in the United States, coming from this rural agrarian background, right? To go off to these cosmopolitan places, to live in New York City, to live in, California. But really her heart was calling her home in a lot of ways. And so we wanted to start there by just showing a really brief clip of a convocation that Belle gave at Berea once she had returned. So we'll show a couple minutes of that, just to root ourselves or ground ourselves in Belle's words.
Okay. Yeah, there we go. The mouse is on there.
By dehumanizing the hillbilly, the anarchist spirit which empowered poor folks to choose a lifestyle different from that of the state and so-called civilized society could be crushed, and if not totally crushed, at least made to appear criminal and suspect. However, the spirit of resistance and revolution that has been nurtured in many of us by generations of Kentucky folks who have chosen self-reliance and self-determination inspires us. It has provided the catalyst for my personal struggle for self-definition. Living away from my native place, I became more consciously Kentuckian than I was when I lived at home. This is what the experience of exile can do. Change your mind, utterly transform one's perception of the world of home. Like many writers, especially Southerners, who have stayed away from their native place, who live in a state of mental exile, The condition of feeling split was damaging, causing a breaking down of the spirit. Healing that spirit meant for me remembering myself, taking the bits and pieces of my life and my heart and putting them together again. Remembering my childhood, I was mapping the territory, discovering myself and finding home place, seeing clearly that Kentucky was my fate. My decision to make my home in Kentucky did not emerge.
Getting us back on track
There
there.
we
Thanks
go.
for handling our awkward digital movements
Yeah.
very well.
I promised myself I would not be the professor who didn't know how to operate technology, but it has happened. It has happened. Abby's going to talk a little bit about some of the artifacts that we found, but we wanted to sort of emphasize this quote where Belle talks about, really the heartbeat of who she is. So she says, quote, "The heartbeat of who I am as a theorist, as a thinker, as an intellectual, really is rooted and grounded in my experience in Kentucky. I would not be Bell Hooks without my Kentucky upbringing," right? And so what we find really interesting is this is often the thing that is not highlighted about Belle and her work, right? One is her spirituality, right? And then two is the fact that she's from a rural community. And I think her later works really emphasize that. But one really beautiful artifact that Abby will talk about is a journal entry.
Yeah, well, so just to give a little bit of, archival context. So Belle's papers, when she donated them, a lot of items were restricted for a certain period of time. So we're actually just recently being able to view her journals because it's been so long after her passing. And so we've been really diving into them lately. And one thing that really comes through, no matter which journal we're really pulling out, is that she's constantly seeking a home. She's seeking a place. She's seeking belonging, right? And she has a whole book, Belonging, A Culture of Place. So one image is just an image from my iPhone. We haven't digitized her journals. We're likely not going to digitize her journals for a variety of reasons. But one quote that is highlighted around the box, she has very tiny handwriting, so I'm just going to read it to you. She writes, it was from Sunday, March 18th, 1990, and she writes, "Learning, I want to go home, to return to a place where there's quiet and beauty, a place where I can be still, the contemplative life." And that's just one entry, right, from 1990. So that's 14 years before she returned to Berea, which brought her back to Kentucky. I'm trying to think of what age she would have been then. That would have been around 40 or so. But that's something that we see in each of them, and not even just one time in each journal. So how the journals are kind of divided up is you have January through June. For most of a year, she wrote every single day. There's an entry for every single day, and it is insane how many times when you're flipping through, she's talking about, I want to feel part of a community. I want to feel home. And you see her struggling with this idea of what that means. So she starts comparing her life in the cities to her rural life. And okay, when my life in the city is good for my social life, and my life in rural areas is good for my spiritual life. And so it's interesting that is what she ends up choosing later on in life.
Kentucky becomes her fate. So Bell Hooks at Berea College. So she comes to Berea in... math escapes me at this moment.
1999.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So in 1999, she's invited to a talk on love and spirituality that is sponsored by the Women's Studies program at Berea College. And in this convocation, it's really beautiful because she is just so overwhelmed with the welcoming she receives. They had made a point to have her whole family was there. There were photos of her family. A child had written a poem for her. So it was really beautiful. I mean, you could tell she's sort of on the verge of tears, and she just feels this deep sense of belonging and a sense of home. So she comes down, she's drawn to Berea's anti-racist beginnings. So as the college, which I'm sure many of you know is rooted in John G. Fee's abolitionism and abolitionist practices and beliefs. And she's definitely invested in this and thinking about this. One quote that we really wanted to pull out is she's often cited as saying, you know, she really felt that she wanted to give back. So Belle's quote is, "I felt very much that I wanted to give back to the world I came from. I grew up in the hills of Kentucky, and I wanted these students to see you could be a cosmopolitan person of the world, but still be connected positively to your home roots." So as a labor college, we get students from all over the United States and internationally. They don't pay tuition, but you know, it's really about altering the sort of material conditions for our students and giving them a sort of platform to change, to move out of potentially, you know, situations of generational poverty, right? And I know that Belle was really aligned with that mission of the college. And she stayed there until her passing. Another thing she was really invested in was she formed what was called the Bell Hooks Institute. Unfortunately, right now it is not active, but during its time, she invited, you know, folks like Cornel West, Laverne Cox, Janet Mock, so really famous folks, cultural critics, theorists to come and talk. And really it was with the intention of holding a space for community folk, just like the Berry Center is doing, to come and engage in these critical dialogues and these conversations and community, to be in community with one another. So this is an artist sketching that's in Belle's papers of the Institute. The building is still there on campus. At the inaugural event was held in September 7th, 2015. She had Laverne Cox. It has hosted Cornel West. She and Gloria Steinem were really close, and Imani Perry. And these talks were open to campus, and really she wanted it open to the community, right? Because she realized that it's a real privilege for you know, college students to be able to attend convocation or attend these events where there's scholars coming in and having these convos, but she wanted it to open it up to the community. And in one of the books, she talks about a local member having the opportunity to meet Cornel West, and it was life-changing for this person. And I think really that's what she wanted the Institute to be. And unfortunately, it shuttered in 2018 when she fell sick.
Yeah, I'll say the other role I think the Institute played for her at the time was really she's inviting these other cosmopolitan people to the Institute. And she, I think, says, I'm not sure which book I can quote right now, but she says in one of them that I wanted my work discussed in the context of who I am, right? So she was like, nobody reading my work is going to understand it if they're not seeing a rural community in Kentucky, if they're not imagining what that's like, if they haven't experienced that. And so I think that's a really important part of it too, is that it exposes the other people who are coming to these communities, and they're actually getting to see that and see the histories and learn about it and engage.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So she donates the papers to the college in 2015. The papers consist of 14 boxes of business and personal correspondence. It's amazing, right? If you're a scholar of feminist studies or just cultural studies, to see who she was in conversation with. It's mind-blowing to be like, this is a letter from, Tony Cade Bambara. Like, it's pretty impressive. Published, there are some unpublished writings, news clippings, photographs, and other records documenting her life, her research interests, and her career as bell hooks. For archivists out there, it's 6.8 cubic feet. So it's smaller than what the sort of partial housing that what Michelle has right now at the Berry Center, but it's very rich. And just recently, as Abby was saying, the journals have become unrestricted, so you can access her journals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what are we doing, right? What are we doing with this information? So as a scholar, a visiting scholar for the Bell Hooks Center, I came to Berea and I wanted to do two things. I'd been studying Bell's work for 15 years. I'm originally from Wisconsin. I don't know if you could tell. Spent a significant amount of time in Louisiana for my PhD in teaching. But I really wanted to, compile an edited collection that is critical essays responding to Bell's teaching trilogy. So at one point, she starts kind of writing books in trilogies. So she has 3 books on pedagogy, and then she has 3 books on love. So I was interested in, how are educators in the K-12 community organizers, how are they using these practices? And I'm happy to say that that is in contract, that edited collection is in contract right now with Bloomsbury Press. The second thing I was interested in was producing this digital archive. So I came to Abby Houston, our digital humanities librarian, as a very naive teacher, and I said, I want to create a digital archive, not knowing what I was doing and the amount of work that is required of a project like this. But I'm happy to say that Abby was excited and welcoming of the opportunity. So what is this project? What does it mean? What is its relevance? If you Google bell hooks right now, there's no home-based website for her, which is unbelievable, right? We know the sort of, her fame rivals that of Wendell Berry, right? I mean, they're very well known nationally and internationally. And we thought, okay, we have her papers, right? Mm-hmm. We have access to her institute. I know her work. I've gotten Abby started reading a lot of her work. How do we honor her and her wishes for capturing her life and her scholarship? She did a residency at the New School in New York where she talked about what she wanted for her papers and her archive. And she said she wanted people like her to be able to come in off the street and access her papers, to not have to show ID and to not have to go through metal detectors. That's not the case, right? She's in an academic library and students, community members have to sign up to access those things. So what we're calling the Bell Hooks Digital Archive Project is a public humanities website. It's a home base for bell hooks where you can go and learn about who she was. You can interact with critical bibliographical information. So educators, community workers, anyone who wants to ensure that Bell's work is still living can access tools and resources. There'll be a page for pedagogical resources as well. So syllabi, lessons, sample lessons. And then the other thing that we're doing, which I'll let Abby talk a little bit more about.
The interviews?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so one thing that I think really struck both of us after Belle's passing is how much we've heard from people recognized on the national and international stage who knew Belle in that way, but not people who knew her in Berea, who were her neighbors, who delivered her mail, who served her coffee at the local coffee shop and all of these things. And so a really vital part of the project for us was expanding that idea of Belle, right? Like she was known on the world stage, and that's a really valid part of this, but she was a person. She was a human just like me or you, and she got up in the morning and she walked down the street and she saw her neighbors and said hello and checked her mail and did these things. And those were really valuable and important relationships to her. She chose Berea for a reason. She felt like it was a community that was committed and passionate about the same things that she was, and that was meant that she was finding her sense of belonging that she was seeking. And so one thing that we've been doing is really conducting these folklore interviews with people who had these kind of intimate relationships with Belle. We've done one so far, which we'll talk about maybe a little bit more about later. But we're in that process of hearing about what other people, what the average person on the street, how their relationship was with Belle, how they understood her, how they understood her work, and how they were thinking about that. So that's going to be one really important part of the website, I think, is really challenging maybe how a lot of people, I don't want to say idealize Belle because we should in a lot of ways, but taking her off the pedestal and recognizing her as a human to human, because that's really what she wanted with people. She wanted to be vulnerable with people, and she wanted to find that intimacy. So,
and I think, and to add to that, just like the real emphasis on rural knowledge, right? Everyday people's knowledge of their own experiences. And I think that interacting with folks on a daily level who had these interactions with Belle really emphasizes how much her ideas and her writing, similar to Wendell, play out in her everyday lived practice. And that's really important, and I think we don't always see that in her published books, but we do see that in her journals, and we're hoping in the papers, and we're hoping to see that in interviews. And the last thing the website will be comprised of is a very curated selection of digitized copies of what's available in the archive. And when I say curated, we've done a lot of thinking around, Berea is still a predominantly white institution, and we're talking about creating a website for a woman of color in the United States. And Abby have talked a lot about thinking critically about our own whiteness, right? And what items we curate and what effect they have based on who's viewing it, right? And so we've had to do a lot of thought work in community with folks, in community with Michelle and Leah, in community with archivists who do what's called critical archival research, and then also Black feminist archives and digital projects. We've been doing a lot of research and work around that. So in terms of where we are, what we want to focus on is really what it means to be Black in Appalachia, right? What were Belle's experiences? So she's talking about growing up in a rural community as a woman of color during the 1950s, right? So dealing with racism, but also dealing with very intimate relationships with white folk across these lines of difference, right? Kentucky being integrated in many ways that we don't think about. And I think that's something that we will talk about later in the discussion in Wendell's work. We see that too. And so what we wanted to highlight is that Belle didn't really call herself Appalachian. What she said was she identified with Appalachian sensibilities. And I love, she frames them in sort of this anarchist, very resistant, focus on self-reliance, these like really radical practices that she deeply admired, and she saw her family and the folks in her life and the local folk around her in Kentucky embodying. And so one quote that she says is, "While I do not claim an identity as Appalachian, I do claim a solidarity, a sense of belonging that makes me one with the Appalachian past of my ancestors, Black, Native American, white, all, quote, people of one blood," end quote, so John G. Fee, who made home place in isolated landscapes where they could invent themselves, where they could savor a taste of freedom. So the last thing, what we've done so far, I'll let Abby go through our list. We're a tiny team of 2 with little to no money.
So far we've digitized about 90 items, which took about a summer and a little bit more, honestly, for us to get through. That's working with 2 students. So it takes a lot of work to process an archival collection, to understand what's going through that. As part of that, though, we have created an inventory, which again, for fellow archivists in the room, that's not often common practice. Archives don't record things by at the item level. They don't know absolutely everything that's in there. It's like, okay, this folder is about these kinds of things and it's in this box, right? And so actually, that's something that Megan has really been doing as part of this project. She's like, we need to know everything that's in this collection. And so it's non-traditional, but it's important. So we have a whole actual inventory of everything that's in there. What you just saw on not the previous slide, but the slide before that was, that's a screenshot of what the website looks like. Right now it is just a shell. So if any of you have pulled it up on your phone or anything like that sitting here, there's nothing populated in it just yet. That is going to be happening soon. We're just trying to lay out our organization, and I'm really learning WordPress right now for the first time. So we have conducted one interview that I mentioned earlier. That was with Libby Falk-Jones, another prolific writer, and she's incredible. We loved working with her. But she was a poet, a writer, and a friend of Belle while she was in Berea. So we had a lovely conversation with her that one of our student workers actually led, which was a really, I think, fulfilling and just meaningful experience to watch a student doing this work and engaging with the writer and asking questions and having a conversation about writing and place and archives and all of that. We have also created or digitized some materials that Libby Falk-Jones brought us. So one part of we really want this to be very community-based. So everybody that we're interviewing, if they have materials related, we're kind of forming a supplemental bell hooks collection, which is really cool. So we've digitized and created metadata for Libby Falk-Jones materials that she's brought us. And we've also worked on website language and how we want to talk about the project and thinking about what our mission is. What we're doing right now is really networking, which is how we're connected to the Berry Center. We see a lot of parallels in our work, and we're exposing ourselves and trying to have as many conversations as we can to really, truly honor her legacy. I'm trying to think on there. We're trying to start a project advisory board because we're both really aware that we are two white women who are working on this archive. And so we've had students of color. We really want to have an advisory board of people who have worked with Black feminist archives, who are Black archivists, and who can help engage us in this work without necessarily having to carry the emotional labor of being in there, because this does have her papers have a high emotional impact on a lot of people. We're applying to grants. You need money to make anything happen, right? So we've been a little bit on hold. We're waiting for some money to come through. I've talked about working with students, but this is kind of our first time. We're not doing user testing here, but really sharing our project and kind of talking about Belle and her legacy and all of this. But we will start piloting user testing once we start getting stuff on the site soon.
Yeah.
So.
And we basically, about a year ago, reached out to Leah and Michelle because we really want to interview Wendell.
Yes.
Yeah. And we've been able to really build a beautiful friendship and collegial relationship where it's been really fruitful to think about these two writers in a very long conversation with one another.
That's a perfect segue to
Yeah.
the things I wanted to talk about. How's that turn out? Yeah, I mean, I think that, bringing these writers into conversation with one another is just a continuation of the conversation they'd already begun. They really didn't spend much time together, physically together, in the same room, but they had profound impacts on one another. And so one of the things that struck me as I was reading The Need to Be Whole, actually it's the first lines of Wendell's 2022 publication, The Need to Be Whole, the very first sentence of the book invokes bell hooks. I'll read that portion here. So he writes, "A decade or more ago, bell hooks came to visit me so that we could have a conversation about my book, The Hidden Wound. That book was published in 1969. The title refers to my belief then, as still, that white people's part in slavery and all the other outcomes of racial prejudice, so damaging to its victims, had also been gravely damaging to white people, a damage too little acknowledged and probably less understood. To know that Bell Hooks, a fellow Kentuckian, thought my book was worth talking about was of course a pleasure and a relief to me. As I recall, our conversation was completely cordial, but what I have most remembered in that conversation is my dissatisfaction with my own part in it. I felt that I had largely failed a dear opportunity." And he goes on in these opening pages, without presuming that they would have wanted it, to essentially, in so many words, dedicate the book to Hooks and to a short list of African Americans who greatly influenced him, and I'll bring their names to the table. The scholar Eddie S. Glaude Jr., his close friend and fellow writer Ernest J. Gaines, and his childhood mentors Nick Watkins and Aunt Georgie Ashby. So by the same token, kind of for her part, Hooks writes of Berry, this is in Belonging. She says, I was excited to discover in my late teens a Kentucky writer whose work bespoke an interior landscape that I understood intimately. I embraced his work. So, in fact, Hook mentions Berry frequently throughout Belonging, both in ways that that she translated the interview that they conducted together, but also she clearly was an avid reader of his work. So, in multiple genres. At one point, excuse me. Let's see, she refers to The Hidden Wound and its insistence that, quote, the psychic wound of racism has resulted inevitably in wounds in the land, in the country itself. She cites Berry's concept of health as whole, as we see in The Body and the Earth, as well as the fictionalized funeral of Nick Watkins in the short story Freedom. there's more, but these snippets, I think, really establish the mutuality and the respect that these two writers had for one another. Hooks wrote of their interview, quote, "I'm grateful that we can transgress the boundaries that would keep us from talking together, from knowing one another, boundaries of race, class, experience." Indeed, these socially constructed boundaries really pale in comparison to the overlaps between Hooks and Berry. Now, some of that is just kind of plain biographical fact, and I think some of that you've seen in this presentation. And I also started thinking about some of the kind of, I guess I would say, maybe philosophical and practical approaches that these two writers made. I stopped myself at 9. I was like, that's plenty. Not to, the easy, they worked in multiple genres, fiction, nonfiction, essays, poetry, cultural criticism. They both made that critical decision to come back to Kentucky, and through that homecoming, really to devote themselves to the people and places on the margins, especially in rural communities. You see in both of their works a real focus on the concepts of belonging, of love, of affection, and not sentimentalized love, but like love in the fullness of it, which means the nasty bits too, the hard parts, and a real kind of championing of agrarian culture. You see a recognition of the danger of dividing the land and the people, whether that's in thought or in practice or in any other ways. And certainly a mutual sense that our care for the land and community all turns on affection, as Berry puts it. You have in Berry writing, this is actually in both of them, an insistence that, to use Berry's phrasing, that race prejudice or white supremacy is the original and fundamental mistake of European conquest in this country, and likewise an emphasis on their kind of mutual interest in working class, especially rural white folks, and of African Americans, that this is the same kind of destructive forces that have been at play. And so we have then this kind of a part of that mutuality, this insistence that we all belong to one another. And that is, as I said, not sentimental, it's not simplistic. It extends perhaps especially to those who with whom we don't agree, and maybe especially those with whom we don't agree who are right in front of us. And that then also leads to the last commonality that I recognize, which is their insistence on working with the local, starting with what's in front of you to do, what's the right thing in front of you to do, in your neighborhood, with your family, with your community. And so one of the, to kind of shift us to the conversation portion of the lecture, I was thinking about those parallels and wondering if you all could if we could talk a little bit about what makes these parallels so important to draw out. And, when Berry, he was reflecting on their interview and he wrote, "To affirm publicly in our time, as she did, the value of our shared culture and allegiance required courage. It required, I think, the same courage by which she spoke always as and for herself." So what do you make of these parallels and why they might be important?
Yeah, I mean, I think my colleague Abby, the whole time driving here, we were talking about this conversation tonight. And that was one thing Abby pointed out, was just the deep mutuality between them and the work that they were doing, right? And this importance on seeing, yes, our differences, but we can't stop at our differences because we have so much more similarity with one another, right? And I think of this argument that organizers often make that it's systems, not people. And I think, unfortunately, the sort of political situation that we live in, and I think Wendell gets at this book, this introduction, where it's like when we just stop at this sort of identity politic of these categories, well, this is a white person, this is a black person, immediately when we identify only with our differences, there's no lines of similarity, there's no nuance, right? Yes, that's part of my identity, but I'm also these other things, right? And I think
seeming to be specific, but it actually ends up being very general.
very general.
Identity isn't biography, you know? All of these things, so Wendell Berry's whiteness informs his identity, but he's not just a white man, right? He's so much more than that, and we all know that in this room. So I think that that's important to remember. Like, again, if we just stick with these descriptive things, these stereotypes that so many of us, like the systems and society force on us in a way, then we don't see what all that we have in common beyond just the superficial, right? And I do think that in their life, it's interesting that they have actual parallels while they also were just sharing so much in common, despite many people would maybe look at them and think they have nothing.
Yeah, on the surface. Well, and I think too, one of the things that ends up happening is that it kind of circumscribes or prescribes people to certain roles that,
Absolutely.
as Hooks points out, is just it's destructive, ultimately destructive.
Absolutely.
And one of those being the kind of association with a Black agrarian identity.
Yeah.
And she is so kind of dogged in emphasizing the importance of a long history of African American farming and connections to the land, and I'm thinking about all the ways that is important for her personally, and also, I mean, how do you think that was could be important for readers, especially people of color who are reading it?
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity. It's this reclamation of self, right? I think what I love about Wendell Berry and Bell Hooks is there's a real dignity on labor and integrity and truth, and labor across like the hard labor of farming the land and caregiving and caretaking for the land. There's a deep value and there's a richness and there's a knowledge in that is passed down. And it's just been deeply denigrated. It's one, we don't talk about Black farmers. We don't talk about poor white farmers, right? We don't, in sort of popular culture, right? We're not thinking of these as like a really dignified labor and a really important labor at this turn in time with climate change and what we're facing, the sort of crisis of the land right now. And I think, what their work is trying to do is to get us to see the value and to get us to come back to these connections and to reclaim these long, rich legacies, because I think there's a lot of ancestral knowledge that we lose when we don't, right? When we leave rural spaces to go to the city because the city has been prioritized, or in the case of Black folk, the assumption is that they're only ever urban. They only ever reside in urban spaces. And like Leah said, she's adamant, no, there's this rich history, and she's also connecting it across lines of Blackness and whiteness, but indigeneity as well.
Right. Yeah, and that there's a kind of return to that dignity of work, even when that work occurs in sometimes dehumanizing circumstances, that there's a rich culture that can still be had, that it's not all only chalked up to the ills.
Yeah.
One of the things that really strikes me about the work that you all are doing is really thinking about Hooks's education or her kind of approaches to education, or interest in education. You've talked about Hooks's homecoming, and at the Berry Center, the Farm and Forest Institute is dubbed an education for homecoming.
Yes.
So, for learning to really live with and from our places and to be satisfied with enough. How do you think Hooks's educational theories helped people, and approaches and practices, how did those things help people for homecoming, do you think?
I think one way that really just jumps out at me is that, one of the titles of her book, I think, is literally Education as a Practice of Freedom, right? So she's viewing education as a way of freeing oneself from like the chains of society. And so I think when you think about homecoming, you have to really know yourself, right? And we can see that even in her journals where it's not clear at first that she's definitely coming back to Kentucky. You can tell that she's still searching and seeking, right? And so she keeps reading and she keeps reflecting and she keeps writing and she works on this for a long, long time and then settles on that. And so I think sometimes, or she really focuses on knowing yourself, loving yourself. You can't heal those in your community until you yourself are healed. And I think education is a huge way that she thinks that allows that to happen.
Yeah, she was committed to making sure her work was accessible, her writing was accessible, and I think she was more concerned with everyday folk reading her theory and her theorizing than she was academics. You know, and I think it's interesting because she still is critiqued at times for being inaccessible or too theoretical, but I mean, her work is really taking sort of high theorists and putting them in conversation with this idea of like, how do I put this into practice in my life? And one of the most beautiful things we find in her papers and in her journals is you see her doing this. It's like she's sort of modeling it for her readers in her books. And then you see she's making lists in her papers about, in this relationship, we're gonna sign this contract of how do we how do we treat each other with these values of loving principles. And we're gonna sign our names to this contract. And so you see her thinking in practice in her own life. And I think she's really trying to model that in her books.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about the way that she brings theory down to an accessible level. When Michelle and I were looking through the archival materials, I ran. This was my English major geek. I mean, I had a lot of them actually, but I was like, there's a letter from Homi Baba.
That was me.
I was like bleeding post-colonial.
Yes, I know. I was like, oh my gosh.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So this is to the point about the your attention to detail in the archive, the things that seem to be perhaps ephemera. I think were part of what Michelle and I found to be so instructive. To say, oh, here's the letter that Wendell wrote to Bell about setting up their meeting, the interview. Okay, here's the interview. Oh, here are Wendell's editing marks. Here are Bell's editing marks. Michelle knows Wendell's writing, she can recognize it at 50 paces, but it was very difficult to differentiate between them.
Yeah.
So she's like, oh, they say that this must be hers, the E looks like this, and so then seeing the follow-up conversation, a handwritten letter on yellow legal pad, which we're used to around here, that is in which he says, here are my editing marks, and you need to admit that your part of this interview was exponentially better than mine, or something to that effect. And then later, a month later, he sends her a couple of short stories, and they're in the file, and so you can see the way that this conversation carries forward, and these are pieces that might seem like, okay, why would you need to know that that's in there? But it helped us to see this is how this evolved. And then you read the book and you see how the interview influenced her own writing and thinking. So anyway, that's my really, really long way.
It's like it's a little breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm curious about what these kinds of, those breadcrumbs, so to speak, what light do they shed on, what the use of an archive is, and how that can be useful to the general public and to academics all the way around.
Yeah. Michelle. I told Michelle at one point I was going to bring her into this conversation because this honestly is my first real experience doing archival research, and there's just so many gems. And I think particularly when we're thinking about the relationship between Wendell Berry and bell hooks, there's such a deep reverence between these two and such a respect. It's just beautiful. And these are prolific writers who are just like Actually, I think you did a better job at this than I did, right? And sort of thinking about Wendell Berry's book, where it's basically so vulnerable to say, I had this opportunity and I missed it, and I'm dedicating this book, this body of work, to this conversation now because I'm ready now to have it. And so it's these moments in the archive. It's sort of an intimate, I want to say it can be almost like a spiritual experience if you're a fangirl, right? Like where you're just like, oh my gosh. But it's these really revealing moments where you peer at someone's life and their practices beyond the sort of surface or the veneer of like they were a well-published author. And it's like, well, actually, they were just an everyday person, and this was their politic, and this is how they lived it, and this is how they modeled it for us as maybe a way of being or a way of thinking about being in the world.
Yeah. One thing Megan mentioned is that I didn't actually read Bell Hooks until after I had gone through her papers. So I'm a librarian, I've been in there. And then I started reading Bell, and for me, I felt like I had a much more like personal relationship with her. And she's known for me, we had on like the second slide that she's like a critic and a dissident, right? And all of these things. And so she's critiquing culture and the way that we do things in her books. But for me, and I don't know if it's a given because I've gone through her papers first and I feel like I understand her in a way and I've seen how she got to where she is. It doesn't feel like a critique necessarily. It is a critique, but it doesn't feel like it. It feels like she's like hugging me and like grabbing my hand and walking me along and trying to show me the path. So I think the archive just has so much to offer in general. Like working on this project, not to make this about me or anything like that, but it's been a really personal revelation and like change, I think, for all of us that have been involved. And I think getting in there and understanding how these people got to where they are, they're showing us the way, they weren't teaching us, they're begging for us to like follow that. And it's really, I think can be really life-changing for people too.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And that I've already found out what you found fascinating in the archives. Don't be bothered. I shared with the most of the Berry Center staff a sweet little excerpt I found from an interview that Bell Hooks did with Lil' Kim.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
oh yeah, that's a good one. That's a wild one. Yeah,
that's worth the trip to Berea.
Yes.
Looking at time and just hoping that we might have a chance for a couple of questions from folks who've joined us here today. Yeah.
Question back there, and he wanted to write it down. So
Oh, okay. Oh, it looks like Eric's got one ready.
Is there one?
Yeah.
All right.
One of the, just while Michelle's distributing and collecting, one of the things that we've been thinking about is how to put into conversation the Bell Hooks Special Collection in the Berry Center's Agrarian Archive, and I think that's something that we will see down the line.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so our question is, this is actually something that, it's probably one of the things that usually gets talked about first.
Yeah.
But we haven't.
Name.
Yes, it's the capitalization.
Oh yeah,
Yeah. So Bell Hooks does not capitalize her first and last name.
Yeah, she chooses specifically not to. I think her rationale, and she later said it ended up not working. Was she wanted her readers to focus on the work and not her as the sort of celebrity, right? So to de-emphasize, and we know that it was a pen name that she took from relatives, right? So she's taking it's a generational name in her family, Bell, and then the Hooks. But yeah, her intentionality behind it was, I don't want it to be about me, very much like how Wendell is. I want it to be about the work, but it didn't work so well. Yeah.
I heard an interview with her. It was John Powell and Bell Hooks. It was just a really, really fascinating conversation. And one of the things that I noticed is that she often referred to Bell Hooks like almost as if Bell Hooks is this third. And I thought that was really interesting because then it's not as if she couldn't say I or me, but that it makes it about like it's sort of this other
persona.
thing.
Yeah.
The other question that we have, which is a really good one, what parts of her work are you not digitizing and why?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that we struggle with quite a bit. Most of the papers we are. The journals are difficult, mainly because we're thinking about the affect, right? So part of the Bell Hooks Fellowship that I have, we have symposiums. So we invite folks from all over the world to come in the summer, and we have guest speakers come and talk. So we had Joy James, like leading thinkers in Black feminist thought and movement. We had Alexis Pauline Gumbs. We had Allison Sarr, the artist, and then folks were doing workshops and panel discussions, and then they had access to the archives. And from a distance, we just watched people sit with some of this material and just weep, right? Just weep because they had such an intimate relationship with like being Black, like being, and so for Abby and I, we're like, I don't know, right, if the right thing to do is to just digitize this and just put it out there. Even though we know that in the sort of contract that she signed, she gave permissions to do that, right? She knew that down the line her work would potentially be digitized. And there still are some items that are restricted until, there are some letters to her family that are restricted until after their passing. So it's really this negotiation of kind of, we want to honor Belle's wishes, but also...
It's kind of like, so I feel like we're going to digitize as much as we can for preservation, but in terms of what is publicly available, it's also because it was still, one reason we're doing this site is because, again, right now you sign up to go in to see her papers, and that does create a barrier that she did not want for her papers. And so if we throw it online, anybody can see that. You do have to have an internet access, and it's still not fully and completely equitable and accessible. But more people can access it that way. But we don't want to have everything on there because it was still really important for her. Just like she brought all these scholars to Berea to view her work in context. I think that was really important to her for her papers. So it really is a balancing act of access, which is it's forever an archivist balance
It's fraught,
of access and preservation and privacy and respect.
Yeah. And when she was alive, she wanted people to come to Berea to interact with her. And there's a quote where she talks about, I want you to see me as in my local context, like the work I do in this context of rural Kentucky. And so we're trying to figure out how to best honor that wish. Yeah. Yeah, I really want to hear your answer about the archival question. What do you think, as the archivist for this Wendell Berry collection, about what's so magical about archives?
Archives help you tell a story, and they give a context to the person's life. And I love it when someone comes and they come in and they are familiar with Wendell, but they have not really an idea about his family, about the work that meant so much to him. And so the thing that I say to everyone is that Wendell says that his father started the important work, and that he and his brother picked it up. And now we at the Berry Center have picked it up from them. We like to think that we have. And the archives help us do that. We always can refer back to something that one of them said in a speech or a letter. The thing I might have mentioned earlier was a letter that Mr. Berry Sr. sent to a member of the congressional delegation, and he was thanking him for staying in place instead of coming back to Kentucky and running for governor. And he said, you're so powerful where you are. You're such a help to us. And he said, and it's such a help to these small people. And by that he meant the average farmer. He also came from small people. They were certainly small when they were taking the price that was being offered by the Tobacco Trust, which was nothing for his year's work. And so he came from that bitter experience. He was galvanized. You learn that he was one of those people who feels something deeply at a young age. That happened when he was 6. And when he was 6 or 7 or 8, he said to himself, if I can ever do anything about this, I will. And sure enough, he grew up, he was educated, he saw an opportunity to become a lawyer and also to work for a congressman in Washington, D.C. And after he did that, he came home. I'm sure, and he was brilliant, so I'm sure he had an opportunity to stay in Washington, D.C., but he chose to come home and to become, as he said, a country lawyer. So there's got a paper where he says, a country lawyer, and what they do. Just this list of, here's what I do. And it's a little bit of everything. He does everything. And he says that that's part of the definition. It's not a specialty. You can do something for almost everybody. And he, in fact, did that very thing. And he had a great heart for the members of the community. I think he was an honored community leader, and he was interested in almost everything. I have, reports on dueling, reports on whatever came across his mind of interest that he didn't know about. He would write a 3 or 4 page legal pad, handwritten report on it. He thought that the tobacco program was a wonderful example of living by the Constitution, by the preamble of the Constitution, where it says that everybody has the right to a stable and well-ordered life. And he thought that bringing of stability to what was then a very large portion of the population, like 16% of us were farmers, bringing stability to that group was going to help bring stability to the entire country, and he was right. And but that's what means something to him, and he thought it was that the program was great and defensible, because the farmers who received loans and could go home with money that they could then pay their bills for, those farmers paid that money back. They had to, when they finally sold their tobacco, they used that money, and the first thing they had to do. So it was not a subsidy. Writings in the margins again. No, it's not a subsidy. Fighting back.
Yes.
To people who
writing back in the margins,
refused to understand that it wasn't. Mostly politicians who determined that they were going to misunderstand on purpose. And he kept inviting them to come here to see. Please come here and see. And perhaps some of them did, but many of them did not. The people that he really wanted to. So that's just one example. That's Mr. Berry Sr. Mr. Berry Jr. was such a wonderful writer, and everything I have a question about the program, about the politics, about the history of what was going on then, he answers in an essay. It's right there, more clearly than I've ever read it in any history book. And so I have a great deal of admiration for all of them, and all of that has come from the archives. Nobody has gotten those papers and turned them into a book. I would never know. Nobody would ever know what was there without somebody to go through. I was lucky enough to have Tom Grissom. Tom Grissom was an agricultural historian. He knew what was in this folder, all the papers related to something that he could name and put in context and say what was happening that year in Congress or in society, he remembered. And so he would do the annotations, and he did that for me. And so I just took those annotations and put them right in my description of whatever the work was. Now, to get down to the paper by paper by paper or letter by letter level is the job that will go on past my lifetime.
It's a big job.
There's a lot.
That's a big job.
But it is worthy. It is very worthwhile and useful. And I saw in a publication the other day something that purported to be about the tobacco program. 20 years past the end of the program, the tobacco program that Mr. Berry Sr. wrote ended in 2004. Well, it's 2024. It's 20 years past that program, and I'm mad. It didn't mention him at all when it was telling about the history of the program. So I don't know whether to write him or not.
Yes.
I'm just thinking, let let them sit there and, and not know.
In their ignorance.
In their ignorance. So anyway, those kinds of things. And that I'm happy to have the knowledge. I feel honored every day that I spend looking at a wonderful letter, something that is perfectly expresses the how much it meant to them in their hearts to do the work that they did and to leave the legacy that they left. And it was almost forgotten and thrown away and overlooked. And so our job is to make sure it's not overlooked, and I think it can go a long way. And we've already done that work in all of the 4 programs that we have in the Farm and Forest Institute, and certainly the bookstore with the cultural programming that Virginia does, and I'm hopeful the archives and the MEAT program. It's our iteration of Beth Douglas is leading the MEAT program, and that's our iteration of the tobacco program, as close as we can come right now, and we're working toward being a co-op. And so putting principles of the tobacco program, the principles of production control, and a price support so nobody loses their shirt because they're farmers any longer, something for farmers to be able to count on, will bring stability, the stability that we need right now, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So I love the archives. Come and go through ours.
Yes. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah.
Well, and we have great resources up here for folks who want to browse, and we'd be happy to continue chatting about this.
Absolutely.
But thank you all.
Thank you so